There you go.
All right. Good morning, Professor. Nice to see you on a nice summer day in the United States.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, cool. So if I start sweating a little bit, it's not a Giuliani thing. I just got done with a long trail run and it's hot in Colorado. And I understand it's even hotter in California.
Yeah, 106.
Yeah, well, it's not that hot, but so thank you for joining us today. When I first thought of doing this show on violence in the history of violence in the United States, I had a set agenda. And then what I found out is I kind of made a mistake. This is going to be one of my more challenging interviews with you because I don't know, it's happy as the country with no history. It seems like the history of a nation often seems like it's tied to violence. And hey, remember that date and whatever. But before we get there, I wanted you to plant your seed. I'm going to have a series of questions, and this is like always, friends. Professor doesn't know what I'm going to ask him, so I'm going to be hitting him cold. And so if he stumbles a little bit, just try to forgive him because he knows the topic, violence in the history of the United States, but he doesn't know what I'm going to ask him at all, and he doesn't know what you're going to ask him. So that's why it's kind of a fun show. It's almost like a quiz show to see how much the professor knows about violence and history in the U.S. But before we do that, I'm John Brackney. I'm a native Coloradoan and a political science degree and a law degree and 3-time elected official and a founder of a city and CEO of a chamber, and I've done a bunch of stuff. Very few are as important as having people understand where we were and where we are and where we may be going based on where we were and where we are. And so I very much appreciate the professor's time on talking about civics and history and politics and where we are as a country. Thank you for participating. Professor, what's your brief introduction?
I'm a history professor at the College of Sequoias. All of my bachelor's, master's, and PhD are all in history. My 4 fields were modern American political history, American intellectual history, Soviet history, European intellectual history, with a cognate field in American literature. And I write for various publications every now and then. My next book review, I'll be getting the page proofs on June 7th for my next review in National Review, a book on Thaddeus Stevens. So that will be my next thing that's coming out. But I write and comment on politics. I also used to be involved in politics. I was the vice chair of the Republican Party for 10 years and a long history of partisan party politics as well.
Awesome. Well, you're a great asset to all of us that are willing to listen to you occasionally. So thanks again for your time. So we now have 25 minutes of your and my time, and then we're going to open it up to another half an hour from whoever wants to ask questions. So I don't know whether to start with what this conversation's not about. Violence in the U.S. Maybe it's nice to exclude huge buckets. So it's not about World War II or World War I or the Spanish-American War or the War of 1812. Maybe. Could it be about the Revolutionary War? Yeah, probably a little bit. And should the Civil War be mentioned? Probably. Is it about, I made the horrible mistake of looking up what the definition of violence was, because, oh my God, the first definition resonates with me, but boy, then it gets deep. And then what are the types of violence? Well, then all of a sudden I'm in a whole morass of emotional violence and psychological violence and cultural violence. And that wasn't my intent. But I will tell you, Professor, one of the reasons that I wanted to have this conversation with you is about the fundamental structure of the United States. We see gun violence and we see massacres in schools and we see violence against women and we see violence against groups, whether it's Blacks or Hispanics or gays. We see all this in the national news and it's really distressing. And people are upset about it. So they want to write their congressman and they organize groups and they donate money. We see an insurrection at the Capitol, and I'm pretty confident it was an insurrection, but maybe you'd want to use a different word. Could it have been a worse insurrection? Oh, yeah. Yeah, sure it could have been. But I know I'm stumbling intentionally almost. My friends are so diverse on this, of whether America is a fundamentally angry, violent, nation, or whether we're a peace-loving nation, and whether we're getting worse or better. And I have my opinions on all that. But and so I'm going to take you through a series of buckets. I almost took my questions and put them into a Gantt chart. And then
Okay.
that got complicated too. So when I asked you what you wanted to talk about in violence in the United States, can you give your big picture of what you think we're going to be talking about?
Well, I always like to keep it simple when I talk about violence, and I restrict all of my conversations to physical violence, because
That's the
physical
first
violence,
definition.
yeah, and physical violence and the threat of physical violence alters human behavior so much more dramatically than any other form of, almost all the rest of those definitions of violence were all just made up social science, modern things that where they wanted to attach severity to something that they cared about, so that they added the word violence to it. But I like to stick with violence classic, meaning physical harm.
Okay.
So just in order to keep things clear, I would like to restrict this conversation to
Okay.
physical
So
harm.
so we started out with the same basic assumption. So when we start out, we had a violent founding. I mean, we didn't just like plant flowers and all of a sudden we had a nation.
Mhm.
We started as a nation in violence, correct?
Uh, yes, but with the caveat that we always have to remember that the American Revolution was unique among revolutions in that it was a conservative revolution, meaning this was a revolution to preserve rights that people thought they already had. It was not a revolution to create new rights. So, in a way, the violence was it was limited and it was targeted, uh, and in such a way that, I mean, for instance, most of the military fighting that most of George Washington's task was simply not losing. There were very few battles that he had to win. So, in a way, the casualties from um, the Revolutionary War were already pretty small compared to the kinds of wars that we'd seen that had taken place in the past. So, I mean, even that has to be put in some kind of a context.
Okay.
But yes, it did
Eh,
involve violence, because you had to have. I mean, I always joke, like, people say that violence is never the answer. I always joke, well, it depends on what the question is. Is the question, what do you need in order to break loose from the British Empire? Then the answer is violence. There would have been nothing short of violence that would have achieved the same result.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. But this isn't a discussion. We could do a whole hour-long conversation on the history of the Revolutionary War, correct? And we might do that at some point. But that wasn't what we're going to talk about in your mind, right? The Revolutionary War. How about this next bucket? Both pre-founding of our country and maybe, I hope not today, but American Indian and indigenous violence against each other, both as settlers and American Indians and the government. And yes, there's been a variety of massacres. We had one in Colorado. There's a Is that what we were talking about? Is that the bucket when we talk about the history of the United States and violence? Would we be sued for malpractice for not talking about American Indian indigenous population?
Yes and no, but again, I always think that all of these things need to be put in their proper context. So if you look at the levels of violence in non-state societies, again, we have to rely on archaeological evidence rather than historical evidence. But there's pretty widespread acceptance of levels of violence in non-state societies, that there were a lot of non-state societies that had wars or massacres or events that took place where you would see 50, 60% of the population wiped out. And then if you also just factor in something as simple as life expectancy, we can't often know what's causing people to die, but if you consider killing someone before their natural death to be an act of violence, and you factor that in, then you would have to say that state violence versus non-state violence, factoring in life expectancy, you should prefer to live in a state society rather than a non-state society, just on average. So
on American Indians, indigenous settler population founding in the United States and growing in the United States, topic for today, or no, that's a whole different bucket?
It could be, but I would just say, like, there's a big difference between a war that kills 60% of your population and a war that kills 3% of your population. I mean, that's a significant difference between a state and a non-state kind of a government.
Okay, cool. I've got your point then. Next big bucket. From 1619 onward, the whole slavery / post-slavery / violent / intimidation, whether it's elections or where you can live, the whole African-American / Black / America thing on how that's done, violence against Blacks. We've had 2 topics on that. We've already done 2 shows on that, and we'll most likely do a 3rd and a 4th and a 5th over time. Is that what we're talking about? Violence, physical violence in the history of the United States? Do we need and must talk about Blacks?
Well, you need to talk about the slavery, because in many ways, this was the institution that was most at odds with our founding ideals, and thus dealing with it. Slavery was a fact of the world at the time of the American founding. And yeah, sure, we can, again, we always understand that 97% of the slave trade took place outside of what became the United States, and that from the time of our founding, before the slave trade was ended, was a narrow time. But so separate the kind of world context from it and just focus on the United States context of it. There's no way around how the attempt to preserve slavery affected American politics at every stage of our development. It almost provides the context for almost every political discussion that takes place, because the fight over slavery began before the American Revolution and continued through the Revolution and through the founding. And I mean, it was absolutely coloring every aspect of American politics in every era. So you in a way, here's another way of thinking about it. If you think of the United States as nothing but an experiment in civil rights, you could say we are nothing but an experiment in civil rights. That's what we are. So how can you separate the civil rights of any group of people from a discussion of the United States, when that's all we really are, as an ideological nation state dedicated to preserving rights? Of course, the worst offenses against rights will always be a part of the national discussion.
So when we were taught, now we've gotten to one that is, you just thought this would be the bread and butter of today's conversation, or no, even though it may be the main course, there's a bunch of other things of violence and human nature and the relationship of an individual versus state as well. Is that an accurate assessment of where we are with 14 minutes left?
Yes, but I would just say that, like, the big story of violence is something we've already talked about, which is rule of law. The presence of property rights, rule of law, you know, and we've talked about this before, but I don't try not to use the word capitalism, but the system people call capitalism, the incentivization of peace is the story, also the story of violence. The greatest miracle in human history is how rule of law and political pluralism has reduced violence over the past 200 years.
So, Professor, that's a great soundbite. And so I wrote down the time of this so I can go back and take that out. But I want to finish with that, or I hope we speak mostly of that, is if people only listen to like 3 or 4 minutes of a conversation, let's finish with that. I also want to see if there's other buckets, though, that we really want to talk about, either for future shows that are raised today or to plant seeds for other people that are interested. I have this big bucket of groups, and that is violence against Mormons or Catholics or Jews or Muslims or women or gays, and so on. I mean, but those are, I think I got most of the big ones. There's a bunch of just really bad, nasty stuff that humans do to another group for whatever reason. I can't think of a good reason. I think they're all bad reasons. The history of the United States compared to other countries, how are we doing on this? Is that a legitimate? I mean, should we do a whole show on that? Or no, compared to the Civil War, John, all those other buckets are not as important. Talk to us.
Compared to other countries, we're wildly more peaceful. There is absolutely no comparison. Having rule of law and a set of principles that you can appeal to tends to, what it really means is that for every act of violence, there's always a political opposition to it. So in every one of those cases, there are people who find it to their political advantage to demonize and popularize acts of violence against any unpopular minority. But because of our pluralistic political system, that also means that you have a political opposition, and there's probably people out there who are taking the opposite position. So that tends to, it doesn't stop violence, but what it does is it does tend to limit it. It usually, and you can appeal to both principle and you can appeal to shame, having a free press, for instance, and having a free political opposition. Again, having rule of law, having to honor election results. These are all things that tend to limit violence.
Yeah. Gosh, great conversation. We have to delve into all that, and we only have 10 more minutes left. Another bucket, internal terrorism, and whether that's Oklahoma City or Waco, but perhaps in the verse, or the Ted Bundys of the world, just all the, I'd say, extremists or crazy people, or people that went off the deep end, or people that are so adamant in their political philosophy that they're willing to take innocent lives to prove a point. And I'm not talking about external violence into the US, September 11th. I'm talking about internal violence. Is that a whole bucket to itself, or would you put it in a different kind of category?
I think so, because in the case of, for instance, lynchings, you have a good 70 to 80 year period where you don't really have, I mean, I have to be careful how I talk about this, but you have roughly 5,000 people who are murdered over an 80-year period. Now, compared to an event like the Holocaust or World War II or Pol Pot in Cambodia or something, 5,000 people over an 80-year period doesn't look like it would have that much of an effect. But the thing about terrorism is, in the American system, when you have terrorism and then to have it backed by local political leaders, it ended up altering the political system of the United States over a really long time period. And
you're talking like the county sheriff and the mayor and
but also jury nullification, because again, you didn't have to murder someone. I always, say to my students, like, and I go through a long story and I say, okay, what if we go out and we start playing football out in the quad? And they're like, okay. And I say, all right. And then when I say hike, then I take out a gun and I shoot you in the head. Well, I'm not playing football anymore, am I? Like, I'm playing murder. And will that alter your behavior if I were to take out a gun and shoot one of you? And then you would all, yeah, I don't have to shoot all of you in order to scare all of you. Because if I shoot you in front of all of your peers, and I have just demonstrated I'm not scared of the punishment, that will scare everybody. That will alter everyone's behavior. And so you don't have to kill that many people. That's why terrorism is so effective. And when terrorism is backed with a combination of fear and local support, it means that it's almost impossible, because we have a representative form of government. So racists, or people who are at least sympathetic to terrorism, when they have their views represented in government and they engage in things like jury nullification, it takes a long time for that stuff to work its way through the court system, to the point where, I mean, you have to start with the 14th Amendment saying that you can, then what we see for that next period is essentially terrorists getting more creative, because as the federal laws would change, they would change their tactics. And you see this kind of back and forth. And then if you had to be frank, anytime a Democrat was in office, those laws would not be enforced. So what you saw over that long time period was, I mean, it's sad to say, what you saw was our system working the way it's supposed to work. But what it can't really account for is what happens when culture is bad. What happens when you have a region of the country that believes a lie, that has bought into the big lie, the big myth, and then excuses the political violence. And again, a lot of good lessons in there for us to draw from. But to me, that is one of the more fascinating eras to study.
Yeah, fascinating. And it goes right back to the second point about our relationship from the slavery, post-slavery era. It just seems like we keep going back to that, and you're just very clear in the importance of that in American history. So
the only thing I'd add to something you mentioned earlier is I would always put rich people in there, because every time we talk about unpopular minorities, I always want to throw rich people in there, because rich people are always considered one of the most unpopular minorities, along with all those other groups that you mentioned at different times.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you. I've got 3 more buckets, actually, or 4. And then we got to get to your main point, and then we're going to open up to questions and answers. We're going to talk about violence in the history of the United States. Seems like we'd want to at least mention family violence. I mean, that's where most murders actually happen. Most brutal stuff happens with loved ones. But suicide and gangs and crime, drug violence, they're a direct relationship of there's a bunch of stuff. That's where most evil happens, is people they know. Is that a bucket to itself and worthy of study in history, or is that a different topic?
I think so. I mean, it's all worthy of study in history. But each one of those things is kind of a different story in a way, because, for instance, if you were to just look at gun violence or murder or homicide, that we have a pretty steadily declining homicide rate. It goes up from the 60s to the 90s and then goes down, and then you have a more recent bump over the last couple of years. But then when you look at something like suicides, that's going up. Drug overdoses, I don't know if you count that as violence, but if you look at violence against women, it's gone down. Violence against children, it's gone down dramatically. With the big leaps, really, the big leaps in reducing violence. I mean, it's funny. The first one was the founding of the United States, and industrialization in Britain. The next big jump tends to be in the years post Civil War, believe it or not, and then World War II, and since World War II. And so we see like big declines with each of those events. And what you really have is the spreading of the application of American values, not just internally in the United States, but throughout the world.
Okay, we're going to go back to that again in the remaining couple minutes, but I have two other buckets. I think this is a bucket unto itself, but maybe not. Political violence, pure political violence. And that's the nuns that, take their hammers to the nuclear warheads. And that's the abortion clinic bombings. That's the insurrection against the Capitol. They're doing political violence intentionally to accomplish their means, internal political violence. Is that a bucket to itself, or did we already address it in some other bucket?
It could be, but I would just say that it's like many other trends. It's one of those things where we tend to see big drops over the last 200 years, and with an occasional spike. So it isn't really that dissimilar from other forms of violence that we've already described.
The reason I bring that up, though, intentionally is yes, the school violence things are just upsetting to my core, and we've already had a whole discussion on that in the Second Amendment. But besides the school shootings, it just seemed to be so devastating to me, and nightclubs and Las Vegas. I mean, that's just really perturbing when innocent people get wiped out by some psychopath. Political violence really bothers me because it seems like it fights to the core of what we are as Americans. And right now we're people of all across the spectrums are saying, well, I'm gonna, and they use political violent terms, both elected officials and people on Facebook. And to me, every time I see it, almost even in jest, I go, do you know what you're saying? Do you really want to be saying that? Do we really want to be encouraging people? So political violence seems like we may not be a country if we're too, if we're not careful, we could actually destroy our whole system, and then we're fighting about other things.
Yes, and I think you're absolutely right. All the other questions you've asked me, I've tried to be talking big terms about big history, but I would say you're absolutely right to be concerned about this because one of the things, if you drop that sort of rhetoric about violence in an earlier era, you would have more pushback. You would have more cultural pushback from institutions. And with the decline of character shaping institutions, what we don't have now is, it seems like you could take almost any position and you would find a group of people who would be encouraging you because there aren't character shaping institutions that you're listening to anymore. So in other words, something like the rise in anti-Semitism. What we see now is sometimes what you call not so much murder as much as it is like casual assault. You know, the individual attacks on people who you don't like, a beating, hitting someone with something like a brick or something, and that is on the rise in the last 5-ish years. And so that kind of thing, unchecked, is what spirals into a World War II. That's what spirals into Rwanda. You know, so when I say that we have violence that has been declining, and I say, oh, but we've had these spikes, every one of those spikes started out with a culture that did not have character shaping institutions that were condemning those acts. And so that's why we should be concerned now.
So, Professor, those character shaping institutions, and most of them are still in existence. Boy Scouts, service organizations, faith organizations, political parties. I mean, they're all still in existence. I think they're all still in existence, but they just have a diminished presence in our society where you don't have to belong to a political party anymore. You don't have to go to the Boy Scouts. You don't have to be involved in faith. You don't have to be involved in marriage, or, I mean, all those things that kind of put some restraining contexts on how we should engage with each other. That's what you're talking about, right?
Yes, but I would say those institutions still exist, but most of them have abdicated their own role in shaping character. And the biggest one would be schools, which you left out. But because most people in America still attend public schools. So having a content-free public school experience is one of the things that is perhaps one of the largest drivers. Then I would say churches abdicating their traditional role as character-shaping institutions, and combine that with people not going. So you have, not only are churches not doing it anymore, but people aren't going to them anymore. So, and the same goes for military service or Boy Scouts, but think of service clubs too. I was in, did we already have this conversation? Were you in DeMolay? Did we already talk? I remember I was talking to somebody about being in DeMolay. Do you know what that is? It's kind of like,
no,
being a Mason, but it was nothing but a character shaping institution for young men. The purpose of the organization was to shape your character between the ages of 13 and 21, you know, and I don't even know if DeMolay still exists.
Never heard of it.
I was one.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
I liked you. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
I was-
Billy, I'm shocked.
I was master counselor, man.
So was I. Yeah.
I'm
Grand-
shocked that you both men are character.
Yeah.
Professor, we're out of time now, and we're going to go to questions. Do give and we didn't talk about the Civil War itself. That's a topic probably all to its own. Did I miss something? Did I miss a major or minor bucket that you really thought we should have talked about when we're talking about the history of violence in America? John, you didn't even ask me about blank.
Well, I guess I would just say that all of America can be characterized as a struggle over the protection of rights. The purpose of our government is to secure rights. So the only thing we didn't really mention is that our system is designed by human beings, and this is a struggle that is supposed to never end. So no matter how good we are at making our society less violent, we never get to hang up our spurs and say we're done now. There will always be a struggle for the protection of rights and individual autonomy. And so this isn't a topic that we can ever say problem solved and walk away from.
Gotcha. Professor, I'm surprised how many arguments, friendly arguments among friends, discussions I'm having with friends who completely disagree with me. America is founded on a noble and just cause, or some other similar types of words. Agree or disagree?
Agree.
A lot of folks disagree. They think we're an evil country. We're founded on wrong principles because of slavery and indigenous populations, but they think we're an evil country. What? Give a line or two on that concerning violence, where there's a conversation on violence.
I would just say that like America was born into a world that was already violent and made it less so. So one of the things that drives me nuts is that people, it's like blaming the fire department for getting your house wet. Like the world was already on fire. The world was full of the transatlantic slave trade already existed, and you're blaming the system that ends it, not the thing that started it. And we're saying that we need to abandon the principles that have made the world a more peaceful, more just place for all of the most vulnerable people in the world. It's completely backwards to say that, no, we need to go back to having a system of arbitrary power and violence. Like it just strikes me as being completely backwards. Slavery existed. We ended it. And you shouldn't blame the system that ends slavery.
Would you agree, Professor, or disagree that we seem, assuming I'm on your side, which I am on this, that we're losing the battle? All the momentum seems to be on the other side, that we're an unjust society. We founded on unjustness, and we're not getting any better, or at least we're not getting any better quicker. Would you agree or disagree on that? Which way is the pendulum swinging?
I mean, it's kind of like, how do you disagree with someone who says that the sun doesn't come up in the morning? Like, I don't know. Like, I can show you the slave records of the slave ships from before, and then we can say that's not happening now. And I guess it is frustrating in a sense, because yes, we're losing, but it's because people will not acknowledge reality. Like, I don't know. There is only evidence that we're right, and there's no evidence that they're right, and we're still losing the argument. And that just tells you that we're losing the argument because people are rejecting the idea that evidence matters.
Well, is it also possible, and this is a whole different conversation, and I'm over my time, but for some reason we're not being empathetic, or we're not being gracious, or we're not being understanding, we're not good listeners or something. I think that we think if somebody were just to take that cut quote, they think you're a jerk, or they think we're a jerk. They think this whole discussion right now is wrong. I mean, and in a way, I kind of agree with them. I think there's been a bunch of jerks out there. I agree or disagree with that?
Well, I agree. However, I do think that, like, we've talked about the difference between sophistry and statesmanship, and that you have to tell the truth in service to truth. And what we want to tell is the truth that people are most willing to accept. However, you got to draw a line somewhere. And you have to also hold other people responsible for being autonomous adults unless you are, I won't concede that human beings aren't capable of reason. The idea is to get people to agree that we're going to use logic and facts and reason, and that those are going to be the terms of the debate. We're not going to have, no one gets to win an argument based on secret feelings or saying this is who I am and my feelings trump reality. Because my goal is always to convince every reasonable person and not to get dragged into counterproductive discussions with people who won't acknowledge a fact. In other words, you can present somebody with, somebody will make an argument and they'll say the Declaration of Independence didn't mean Black people. And you say, well, who wrote the Declaration of Independence? I'll say Thomas Jefferson. So, okay, here's his first draft that he submitted to Congress. And it refers to Black people as persons. And it refers to slavery as evil. Now, if that person then says, well, I don't care, or they say, yeah, but still, well, you're talking to someone whose who will not acknowledge a fact. They will not acknowledge reality. And I don't know what to do other than to send that person to a therapist or something, but it's not something that you can engage as a part of public discourse. I can accept a fact or a correction or whatever, but what I can't deal with is someone whose, psychological problems are preventing them from engaging in public discourse. Which seems to be what people want to do now.
It seems to be the common way of discussion. I don't think I'm going to use that cut quote because, man, there's going to be a lot of hatred over that quote because that applies to a lot of people these days, and they don't want to. I don't want to agree to that.
But
okay.
But when you show them the chart and you say, like, this is how many murders took place, this is the percentage, at that point, you need to incorporate that data into your assertions, or all you're demonstrating is that your father couldn't show you affection or something. Like, I don't know but you're not demonstrating that we're having a discussion where we based our thesis on facts. A thesis needs to take into account reality, or it's not of any use.
Professor, we've got there's a lot of places around the world, and there's been a lot of times throughout history. Is there a better place and a better time to be alive today, to have peace, both in trade of exchange of information and product? Maybe there are, but is this a pretty good time? And are we getting better or worse? Then we're going to open up to questions and answers after you answer that.
I mean, I guess part of the answer would be like 6 years ago, but if you mean in terms of era, like a 10-year period in world history, then the answer is no. This is by far the most peaceful and prosperous time in world history.
Dislocation, United States in this decade.
Well, I would just, not necessarily the United States, but I would say every government that recognizes rule of law, because now the United States is, maybe the 10th or 12th freest country on earth, which is kind of sad. But so if you look at the countries that are freer than the United States now, they're all doing better than us over the long term on all of these things as well. Okay. There is a corollary between the protections of freedom and peace and the absence of violence.
Yeah. Okay, team, forgive me for going over. We will go about 5 minutes over to about 12:05 Mountain Time. Jay, you're a first-time caller, first-time questioner. You don't have to ask a question if you don't want to, but I'm going to give you the honor of doing so if you have one. Jay.
I do have one. So let's assume, like going off what John was saying, let's assume that like America was founded off terrible ideals. We were super violent in a peaceful world, all those things. What is the motivation now for so many people to basically focus so much on how bad we supposedly were versus the progress we've made and the general good direction that we're going?
Well, the motivations are as individual as the person who's making them. But I would say the primary motivation would be ambition. Your life will be a lot easier if you adopt that outlook. Your path will be easier in school. Your path will be easier in the workforce. Your path will be easier to advancement in corporate America. Your path will be easier in politics. So all of the incentives are to make, in terms of your personal life, are to make those kinds of arguments and to be as radical almost as possible, because there's almost no disincentive to being a radical.
Say it again in one more way. I think I understood Jay's question, but you gave me a different answer. I have a lot of friends who really want to bring up all the negative, both in their personal lives and in their last employer and in their last town and in our state of the nation. And I kind of get it in a way that they just see that it's so brutal. They're pissed and they want to get to the root problem, and they go, yeah, it's been going on forever and we got to fix this and have a just society. So from that angle, I get it. But you gave us a different answer. Jay, you were satisfied with it. I saw you nodding your head. Professor, I don't understand your answer though to Jay's question. What am I missing?
So let me give you like 2 or 3 different scenarios, right? If you are a 5th grade teacher, and you want to be able to teach your students proper American history. Well, number one, you would have had to take a bunch of electives in college that weren't required. You would have had to seek out professors who knew what they were talking about. And then you would have to read a bunch of books and do a lot of work. Or you can just take the classes that are required, get your degree, and then when you get in the classroom, you don't have to know anything. You can just say America's bad, slavery's evil, write a paper about how you feel about it, and you will meet all of the criteria that you're supposed to meet because you had your students write a paper, they shared their feelings, and you're going to be teacher of the year. So think about how all of those incentives work. Now take somebody who's in a corporate environment. If somebody comes in and says, we're now going to reshape our corporate culture based on critical race theory or something, and you aren't one of the groups in the hierarchy, then the only way that you can achieve the desired result is to take the most radical political position possible to make sure that you're never outflanked on any particular issue. And if you do that, then you will never have your career or your job threatened in that particular corporate culture. Does that sort of?
Yeah, that really, I'm so glad I asked the follow-up question because I didn't get your answer the first time. But Jay, are we on, all 3 of us at least on the same page? Does that make sense now to you?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for the opportunity to ask a question.
Huh. Wow, I'm fascinated by that answer. Okay, I need to do some deep thinking on that. So it's tied between Frank and Bill for being our longest time caller, and I want to honor either of you by asking the next question.
Okay,
there you go, Frank.
Yep. So the follow-up, Professor Tootle, is I get it. It's easier to not be an educated educator. How is it beneficial to what I perceive to be the powers that be on the left?
Don't use left.
Well, it could be left. I don't know. Yeah.
Liberal on the left of center politically, to encourage this decline in America.
Well, you don't have to know anything philosophically. Like I mean, if you think about at its very basic level, if you accept the premise that the definition of generosity is taking stuff away from other people and giving it to yourself, then that's a different definition of generosity than I have. But if your definition is what kind of political ideology can I have that allows me to say that I get to decide every issue, and whatever I think or I believe will be financially rewarded. There's nothing easier than if you're at a cocktail party or in a pool party in my backyard last week, you'll overhear people say stuff like communism's a good idea, it's just never been tried. And then you watch as everybody just kind of goes like, yeah, well, you're right about that. Like, no, it's not a good idea that's never been tried. It's a terrible idea that's been tried a lot. But you have to know something, because in order to have that conversation, otherwise, it's always easier to take the position that will cause people to just go, yeah, that's right. Rather than to take the position that requires you to actually know something. So,
but if the ultimate reality of taking that position, Professor Tootle, is a smaller pie, if you will. I mean, we're going to do rule of law drives success, a bigger pie that we all share, but we're driving to a smaller pie that we're going to try to divvy up, but it's less. It's less.
Well, I don't know if I've been trying to lose weight for a few years now,
And you've done a good job, Professor, by the way, you have.
I got that last 20 pounds that I got to try to, knock off. And I think I've said this, maybe not on this, but the hard thing about a diet is that you have to eat like a skinny person while you're still a fat person. And if you think about how incentives work in your personal life, you care a lot more. Yes, you can say, I care about the fact that my position will destroy civilization. But here's what I know right now. Taking it means that I get an 8% raise next week. So there's a lot of people who will say, I'm going to take the 8% raise and keep my mouth shut because I think the collapse of civilization might be 20 years down the road, and I'm going to take the raise right now and not upset anyone. In other words, I mean, why do we print $2 trillion worth of money in the last few years? Like, the incentive is to take the easy short-term solution now and kick the problem down the road. That's just, I don't know how to say it, but that's just how people are.
Then we need one heck of a better argument than we've got right now.
Well, the argument, we have the good arguments. What we need is, we need to reset the terms of the debate and say that, I've been in meetings before where somebody will publish a manifesto that says, we need to do X, Y, or Z. And I'll just say, can I get us, before we even get started, to agree that that we should actually care about whether students learn something. Can I agree? Can I get us all on the same page first, that teachers are supposed to teach and that students are supposed to learn? And what you find is that I should maybe not call them crazy, but let's call them the extremists, will have that battle because they're so radicalized that they believe that you don't need to teach and that learning is racist. But what you want is to have that that debate in the open early, because what you'll find is every reasonable person will say, of course, this is a college, we're supposed to care about learning, and then you will kind of expose like, oh, it isn't 70% of our faculty that are a bunch of radicals, it's 3 people who make a bunch of noise. And maybe we shouldn't alter this entire institution of higher learning that educates 13,000 people a year and get rid of teaching and learning because 3 radicals are bullying everybody. But in a way, it's what originally drew John and I together was listening to Arthur Brooks. And I think we both had the same experience when we listened to him, was that he was teaching us kind of how to do this. How to do this in a way that people would actually listen to us. In other words, if you actually care about results and you can set your own ego aside, which is often difficult for people because nothing feels better than laying a sick burn on somebody, but you have to always resist that temptation and try to keep your eyes focused on reasonable people, even if the reasonable people are not making the most noise. It's hard not to be distracted by the radicals. And like Eisenhower said, you want to stay up there in the middle where the road is the smoothest. You don't want to get the others.
And let me just add to that, from being a Republican before I could vote in 1982-ish, and 84 was the first year I could vote, I was always pretty passionate about being a conservative and a Republican up till 5 years ago. But I was always more interested in the numbers and the data and the history and stuff. It was important stuff. I lived most of my life that way. But it really wasn't until Arthur said crazy stuff like, I don't care about any of that stuff. I just want to care about another human being. And I'm going to make it my life's mission to bring more people out of poverty. People, not numbers, not data. I want to help people live a more productive and happy life, the pursuit of happiness. And so it's so interesting for me to be in DC with Stephen and hear the major CEO think tank of a conservative organization said we should be based off love and caring for our fellow man, our human beings. Let's make a difference. Let's help them. I love that stuff. So anyway, it hasn't changed my life, but it's been really meaningful. So sorry to do the gratuitous shout out to AEI and Arthur Brooks, but he deserves it. We've still got another 10 minutes. Catherine, you don't have to, but I want to honor you. If my memory is right, you're a member of our Building Relationships and Diverse Groups for Equity. And I want to give a shout out to a group that I helped co-found. Do you have a question? You can just do yay or nay. You don't have to. You have a question? Unmute yourself and ask away.
Thank you. Yes, I just wanted to say I think it's great to see Professor Tootle get involved in public conversation. Okay. I've not been a professor, but I have a master's degree in German history. Okay, so I've studied extremism. I wanted to ask you a little bit, your ideas about the decline in violence. Is this, have you read Steven Pinker? Is that where you're getting a lot of that?
No, but we're looking at the same data. So, Pinker is an aggregator of data, and this stuff comes from a lot of different sources. But Pinker was great at popularizing much of the same data that I would be looking at.
Okay, and I had a second question.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, and I just wanted to say, I in listening to you, you have a complex approach, which I think is important. You know, people have a hard time with gray areas. I think John has that, you know. John's really trying to figure his way through these gray areas and have real conversations. One thing that you said earlier about, you know, America has been the solution. I agree with that, you know, to slavery and all of that. And I don't have the in-depth experience that you are having, but on social media conversations, it does seem to me that a lot of the criticism of our founders and of our systems is really focused on the institution of slavery. So the institution of slavery is sort of different from this idea and this pursuit of of protecting rights. It's the United States being an idea of protecting rights. So in the context, so that's a wonderful, positive thing. But in the context of that, there was this horrible institution that came into the United States, and the founders were grappling with it, right? And so I do think in our public conversations, we have to be careful. And we have to understand when people are really honing in on and being angry and focusing in on the system with, you know, the founding was bad, 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 or the founders themselves were bad, bad, bad. I think we have to kind of understand people, and we could maybe help them along, right? To understand that institution is something separate from this idea of protecting individual rights, right?
Well,
I mean,
Professor, what's your response?
well, I would agree with you, except for the part where you said the word separate, because slavery existed and was a known fact among the founders. So the old debate over slavery was always like, is it an exception to American liberty, or does it explain all of the American experience? And I reject that. I reject both of those arguments because it was too large of an institution to be an exception, but nor does it explain every aspect of American liberty either. The correct answer is that it was a fact of life at the time of the founding that the founders themselves had to grapple with. So, for instance, if you look at the rise of the rights proclaimed as English citizens in Virginia, they were precisely the rights that they took away from slaves as they made more distinctions between indentured servitude and slavery. So slavery, you can't say that it didn't influence the understanding of rights, because they said, oh no, we need to take away their firearms. We need to prevent them from assembling. You know, we need to do precisely these things to take away rights. And then the other thing I would say is that because it was a fact that the founders were aware of, it was always the extreme case that was used in debates. You know, oh well, we don't want to be like this. You know, so I mean, it's everywhere in their conversations. So what we're really asking for is just to put these questions into their proper context. In other words, like, it's not enough to know that somebody's standing in front of a car if you don't know if the car is moving. Like, is it safe to stand in front of a car? Well, is the car holding still? Is it moving forward, or is it going in reverse? That's an important context. Like, if you're saying, like, here's slavery, well, was it ending? Was it starting? Or was it holding still? That seems like an important distinction to make. And does that make sense as an analogy? Like,
yeah, no, it's a great analogy. And I don't want to take anybody else's time. I do have a question about that, but there are other people who haven't been able to ask a question.
And you can come back again, Katherine. Thanks for being here today.
Okay.
Bart, you took yourself off mute. I assume that means you have a question.
Yeah, I just, my question is one of those, it's almost like a firing line question, professor, agree or disagree? Because I didn't really, a few weeks ago, I was listening to something, a podcast or something, and a historian was talking, and the historian indicated that the period of time we're in right now with all of our divisions, politically and everything else in our society, is actually more similar to that total continuum of American history, if you go, way back to 1776, than it is with the period that I guess, John, you and I grew up in. I mean, I grew up in the 60s and the 70s and maybe the early 80s. And the country was relatively unified during that period, really from 1941 to about, I don't know, 1966 or 1967, we were pretty unified. Then the anti-war protests started against the Vietnam War, and the country became more splintered. It's, my question really to the professor is do we kind of have to become more comfortable with the divided nature of our society than we are, because that really is kind of the way the country has been over the continuum of American history?
You're right, and well, what we need are editors and context, because it isn't that society is more violent now. But we are more aware of violence. For instance, there were more kidnappings years ago, but then we became aware of all the kidnappings. There were more mass shootings before, but now we're more aware of all the mass shootings. We're more aware of things that are happening, so that our individual brains are constantly struggling to put acts of violence or tragedy into their proper context. And we just we're sort of hardwired to always emphasize any threat to security. In other words, it will end human tragedy. But in a way, it was far more injustice before. We just didn't know about it. So what we have to struggle with every day is we don't want to become numb to it, but we also don't want to let it overshadow the big truths. Yes, individual human beings are capable of horrible acts of violence. And yes, with bad leadership, good people will commit horrible acts of violence. But on the whole, most people are good and like to think of themselves as good and conceive of themselves as being good. And if you encourage what's best in them, you will get a good result. But what we really need, because of all this mass communication, is we need context and we need editors. The two things that we don't have, by the way. All information is coming at us out of context and without an editor.
That may be a good way to end the show, but just in case somebody else may have a comment, Jake, you've known the professor longer than anybody else, so you should at least have the chance to ask a question. You don't have to. The show might be over. It's already 12:06 in Colorado. Jake or Hope or Darren, Jay, who else? Ben, anyone else have a quick question, or should we declare victory for today? Ben.
Just a real quick comment from the professor. Professor, have you heard about the concept that human beings are predisposed to violence based on their DNA? I just read something recently on that. I find that kind of interesting, that we're predisposed to that, but yet we can control it and say, hey, we're just not going to be violent on this particular day.
And quick answer, Professor.
Yes, but the good news is that there are very few people who are predisposed towards, and actually it isn't so much violence as much as it is indifference to the suffering of others. But in order for someone to have that activated, they typically have to experience violence as young people. So someone who is genetically predisposed to not care about the suffering of others, if they end up having two loving parents, will by and large then grow up to lead a productive and peaceful and happy life. It's only when you get that combination of a genetic predisposition to not care about the suffering of others with an act of violence or violent parents or sexual abuse or something like that, that we see that kind of behavior then activated. So the answer is yes, I've heard of it.
Kind of hate to end on such a
Sorry.
bummer of a topic.
Hope
Hope, are you still with us? Can you ask that question live rather than typing, Hope?
Okay, sorry. I'm just so upset that I was waylaid, and I'm so sorry that I was late because this is such an important topic.
Glad you're
Um,
here.
Thank you. I do have to wonder if Americans specifically as a group, not if, why, I guess I should say why, we do tend to have much higher statistics than say in England on both civilians or citizens killing each other and law enforcement killing civilians. And is that because we do not have gun regulations? I mean, it's too big of a question for the end of a meeting, which is why I thought I would type it rather than ask it, because I wanted somebody else to say, actually, Hope, that's too big of a question for right now. But
No,
it's just something
glad you
on my
asked it.
mind.
Quick answer, Professor.
Is that it depends on how you categorize acts of violence. So England has a greater incidence of violence involving assault, battery,
Oh, okay.
weapons, bricks, that sort of thing. But because they don't have a lot of guns there, they don't have a lot of gun homicides, but they actually have a far higher rate of other forms of violence. So here's your trade-off.
Interesting. Okay.
Here's your trade-off. We have more guns, so we have less people hitting each other with bats.
Right.
So we have more murders with guns, but we have fewer acts of assault with weapons. So there doesn't seem to be, it's always a trade-off, I guess.
Right. Okay.
There
That's
isn't.
interesting.
Appreciate you being here. But Professor, I'll take the privilege, since no one else has jumped in, to ask that big overriding question again, and you only have a minute or two to answer it. America is blank in the history of the world regarding violence.
America is the greatest force for good in all of human history. And the closer that we adhere to the values of our founding, the better it is for humanity. And that is a demonstrable historical fact backed by incontrovertible evidence as American ideals have spread throughout the world.
Love that. Thank you. So team, we're gonna shut off. Tony, I don't know if you can do it now that you jump back on. We're gonna shut off the recorded video. Before we do though, the professor has agreed to a debate on that very last point. And so we're trying to find a very thoughtful, skilled, educated, liberal professor who will debate that type of point, among others, on June 19th, which is Juneteenth. The professor and I have a very strong passion in race and race relations, although I don't like either of those words actually. So Professor, you'll help me at some point in that. So if you're interested, we're going to do a special show on Saturday, June 19th. We'll probably still do one on that Friday as well, if the professor allows. Hope you join us. We're going to go ahead and shut off, but if a note to, if you sign up early or sign up late on this Zoom, you get to have a couple minutes of private time with the professor. So hang tight with us. Don't hang up unless you want to. Thanks for being here, Professor. Appreciate the topic. Next week is going to be on the history of elections in the United States. Are you comfortable with that, or would you rather choose a different topic?
Always, yeah.
Okay, I'm shocked that we're still dealing with a presidential election on June 4th of the off year. I'm just completely shocked, and we should discuss that because everybody else seems to be doing so. So we'll see you next Friday at 11 o'clock. Thank you for being here. Professor, last word.
Love the discussion, and this is something that I've been focused on for years. So I'd love to get a chance to share it.
Great. Thanks for your time, y'all. And we can stop the recording, Tony.